Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fully Books, the Hidden Gems author podcast in which Craig Touch and myself, Roland Hume, get to talk to some fascinating figures in the world of self-publishing, writing, and becoming an author. And today we have a very special guest who I'm extremely excited to chat to. It's Melinda Curtis, who is herself a USA Today best-selling author, but she's also the author of a book called Frankly, My Dear, and it's about creating unforgettable characters. And we're here today to talk about creating unforgettable characters. So Melinda, good morning. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you guys for having me.
It is we're very excited to chat to you. And of course, we wouldn't be having this podcast without the man himself, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems Books and an author himself. Craig, how are you doing?
Doing great. Thanks. Yeah, we're really excited because this is one of those topics that is so important when you're writing novels, is to create unforgettable characters, right? That's the stuff that sticks in your mind after you put the book down. You know, there's a lot of things you might forget, but if you love that character, you know, that's the thing you're going to remember. That's what you're going to want to come back to. Often, you know, people that write series, even when they're done, people fall in love with those characters and they're like, they want the author to write more, which is great for the author, right? Because series do really well. And if you have those characters, that's what makes people come back, especially because a lot of times, like, each book is about different things. So it's not like it's not the storyline continuing. There might be overarching plot lines or whatever, but it's the characters that are static throughout, right? So definitely a topic that we really wanted to dig into and I've wanted to do for a while. And since you've literally written the book on the topic, you're the one to talk to. So you know, thanks for coming on. And so why don't you tell us a bit about the book and, you know, what made you write it and all that stuff. And then I'll jump in from there.
Okay. Well, it started out as I'm kind of a psychology nerd. I have I'm like one course shy of a psychology minor. I was a business major and I was, you know, like minoring in statistics. And even though I was fascinated with psychology, I didn't really see at the time how it was going to help me to, you know, until the day my mom died, she would, you know, kind of say, are you ever going to go back and complete that psychology minor? Like, she was all about completion. So I read papers, you know, when professors publish papers, I actually am one of the nerds who will read a psychology paper, because I think it's fascinating. And I read a psychology paper about why people are maybe not in a good place or a happy place, and they might seek therapy. And the study had been done on why people seek therapy and what are the most common reasons. And there were 18 of these common reasons. And then it also kind of hinted at the fact that this guy was going to write a book, and how psychologists should take them through if they were raised this way or if they had something happen in their quote unquote backstory, real life backstory, right? And I was excited about it, and I was chitter chattering about it to my critique partners, and they were just like these glazed eyes, probably as you all are right now. And then I began to say, oh, it's like Cher was abandoned by the greatest love of her life in her backstory. Her husband died, and she was so bereft that she wanted to have a husband, but she didn't want to be in love, right? And that's the part that makes her such a great character, is her journey to find out that, you know, you can't just go through the motions and be happy. You really need to find love, even if it's messy and, you know, complicates your life in so many ways. And that's what makes these unforgettable characters, you know. And then I started to, when this professor published his book about how psychologists should, you know, help people become whole, like what kind of journey they go on to get whole. And you can kind of see it in the book. I kind of plot through, okay, so this type of character, this is what Cher had to learn. These are the things that she went through in the story that made her learn this and grow into a happy person. And that's why we are fascinated by good story and good characters, right? Because they grow, they change, they learn something, and we can relate to it on some level.
And of course, you're talking about the Cher's character in the movie Moonstruck. For those of
Yes.
of
Sorry.
you that
Loretta.
haven't watched that movie, yeah, I mean, it's great to use those examples, right? Because that's the part of the movie that people remember of most movies. They remember those characters. They remember, the great De Niro characters, the great, all those people that are great character actors. You might not remember everything about the plot, but you remember that character. And so then, using movie characters as examples to sort of illustrate your point, I think is what really helps, right?
Oh,
so I think you'd have to find some pretty. There are some rare books that like everybody in the world has read, like The Great Gatsby or something like that. But apart from that, movies just make it so accessible.
Yeah. So many more people have watched them and remember them, and yeah, for sure. And it's funny, I had the same sort of background where I went to university for, I actually went in for the writing program, but then I didn't like their program and switched to psychology, and actually got my degree in psychology as well. And I agree, like it gives you sort of that understanding of people that allows you to, write those kind of characters that people. You understand the motivations that turn people into what the character that they become, which is so often the issue, I think, with people when they write, is they don't always give enough backstory and insight into the character and what made them become that way.
Or they do a character dump, like a 5 or 8 or 10 page character dump in the beginning, where you're like, okay, so it's not relevant backstory, right? That's kind of my biggest gripe. Like Julia Quinn, who wrote the Bridgerton books, if you read that series, she wrote prologues, which were essentially the relevant backstory for the main character. And sometimes you would be kind of teary-eyed and moved at the beginning of that, at that prologue, which you're like, how can she in 10 pages get me to cry? And she really tapped into those feelings. I mean, I know that a lot of newbie writers, they reach for what can I put in a character's backstory? And there's all these interview sheets or whatever. And I would say to you, there's 2 ways that I recommend going about creating backstory. The first is, how were they raised? So, okay, if you're a Klingon, right, you are raised to hate Starfleet, and everyone associated with Starfleet. So that's the way they were raised. You can have a character that's raised a certain way in a subculture of whatever world you're writing in, whether it's a small town or an alien planet. A great example is Elle Woods. She was raised to be a modern day princess because she was raised to be a corporate trophy wife, right? She was getting her degree, but she was really looking for that, her boyfriend that she had in undergrad was the perfect guy for her. He was going to be a lawyer. He came from a wealthy family, all this stuff. And she was a kind princess. We loved her, but she was raised to believe that if she wanted something, she could have it, right? How hard could it be to get into Harvard? We laugh about that. And she went about it in a totally unorthodox way, a totally Princess Elle Woods way. And then on her journey, she had to learn that, you do have to work for things that you really want. And sometimes the working for things is what gives you satisfaction rather than just getting something easily,
What a wonderful example.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
I love that film, Legally Blonde. I watch it with my 85-year-old father, who is a chartered accountant. It's like we watch it and we love that because she's such a vibrant, strong character. And you're right, her backstory is like so important to the decisions she makes moving forward.
Yes, and that in that situation, her backstory is, it's part of that introduction, how she's going about her perfect little day and being kind to people and dropping off notes and giving encouragement, and people are interacting with her and she's clearly loved, so yeah, that's a great backstory. I mean, I would argue that season 1 of Game of Thrones was the backstory for all the main characters, right? We learned all their backstory in season 1, but really all the good action started in season 2.
Yeah, I mean, George R. R. Martin, he takes characterization to another level. I can't, every time I read, his stuff, I'm just, as a writer, I'm just like, I don't even understand how he holds all these characters in his head to the level of detail that he puts into them. I can't even conceptualize the maps and the family trees and everything. My whole office would be just littered with all sorts of reference material that no wonder it takes him 10 years to write a book.
Right?
It doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, that's it exactly. But the other way to go about creating a character is to look at the defining moments in their life and what shaped them, right? So they could be raised, Klingon one way, or they could have these defining moments. And psychologists argue that we have probably, 5, 6, 7 of those in our lives that make us who we are, right? And it can be something as horrifying as what's Ryan Gosling's 6 in The Gray Man. CR6 is his character's name. And, he was abused as a child, but they didn't like heavy, angsty reveal all the abuse to us up front, or even when they revealed it, it wasn't really heavy. So you can choose how angsty and how much angsty you portray in your stories. But it can also be as kind of inconsequential, but still hurtful as a betrayal, like a husband's betrayal of a wife could be a defining moment, because it's kind of like an if-then statement in math. When something hits you emotionally, impacts you emotionally, whether it's super joyous or super bad in a super bad way, it creates this if-then statement in your head. So if I trust this person, if I, trust a man in a relationship to a certain point, I will be hurt. It's kind of that kind of thing that you create. It's like a useful example is because we create these what are called schemas in our head all the time. So let's say, for example, you were riding a bicycle through a stop sign intersection and you did not stop and you rode your bike through and you were hit by a car. That creates in you, okay, I'm going to get hurt if I don't stop at the stop sign. And my husband is notorious for the California rolling stop through stop signs, and I am always like, you have to stop. Because as a child, someone was driving me home from a birthday party and we were T-boned. And I was like, stop signs must be at all cost stopped at, right? So it creates these things of who you are in little ways and in big ways. Exactly. If you think about, I'm going to spoil a little bit of The Gray Man just for the fact that Ryan Gosling's character, right? He didn't really have family connections because in his backstory, he had murdered his father who was going to abuse and kill his younger brother. So it made him a fantastic killer, right? Because when people have him in the death grip and he's fighting for his life, he channels his father and what happened to him as a child and uses that emotion to keep fighting and keep going for his life. So it kind of defines that character. So instead of taking filling out a character interview, if you find those defining moments and tell them at the level of emotion that you're comfortable with, it can be super powerful because we can all relate to different things like this in characters.
Yeah, and it's amazing what you can do with that, because like you said, if you took an event in somebody's life, like you said, your spouse cheats on you, right? One character might react to that completely different than another character because of their backstories that you could then reveal later, right? Like maybe the person gets cheated on and they're like, yeah, whatever, I don't care. And you're like, well, that seems odd. And then later in the story, you reveal that the reason is because, they're used to cheating because their parent, their father cheated on their mother and their grandfather cheated on them, and that's what they expected. So it just didn't make any, it didn't matter to them. Whereas the reader might be thinking, well, that's horrible. How come they're not acting like that? And then later is when it all gets revealed and all of a sudden you understand.
Yeah. I mean, the one caution about that, because I write romance and I teach a lot of romance, craft classes, and people will say, well, she doesn't want to have a a relationship with guys because men cheated on her mother. And I said, oh, but psychology would say it has to directly impact you. So in the situation, Craig, that you just mentioned, it would be, so I grew up in a family where the mom, cheated on the dad. And the one time that there was a confrontation, or anytime there was a confrontation, blows would be exchanged. And I want to avoid that situation, right? So you have to kind of bring it into a more personal level where it actually personally impacts the character.
Yeah, I think most of the authors would be putting more thought into their examples than what I just did in that 2 seconds there where I came up with that example. But
it was a test.
It was a test. Yeah. No, but what I love about all that sort of thing in the backstory stuff is, and I see it often in stories and in movies, is when you have this character that's acting in some sort of way, often an archetypal way, often the villain, right, where he's doing all these bad things, and whether they've gone into a lot of backstory or not, that type of character, he's the villain, he's going to do bad things, blah blah blah, right? But then later they humanize him by telling his backstory that sort of justifies what, maybe not justifies it in the sense of like, yeah, it's okay that he did that, but now you understand why he did that. He's not doing that because he's an evil person necessarily, but because of what happened to him previously. And that's the backstory. Mm-hmm. The reveal of the backstory can be used in so many really powerful ways. I love that sort of way of doing it, right?
Yes, without doing the character dump, the full character dump.
Right.
If you think about it, if you're writing a story where, maybe it's a buddy film, like in Gray Man, what is Anna de Armistice character's name? I forget what her name is, but she's kind of the person who teams up with Ryan Gosling's character. And there's a point where, she says, well, all the people in the Sierra program were recruited from prison. What did you do to go to prison? And he's got that reveal. So you always want to, throughout your story, you always want to leave a chance to reveal more of that story, more. So it's like an iceberg. A person is like an iceberg, and you reveal further down the tip of that iceberg as you go. So even though Julia Quinn has those prologues, that's prologue all about Anthony, right? Then it doesn't fully reveal all the parts of Anthony's story and his emotional wound that he went through. I mean, that comes out with the heroine who he's getting closer to. So if they're a band of brothers, they're going to be revealing things about their past. If they're lovers, they're going to be revealing things about their past to get emotionally closer and kind of cement that bond, or not.
Yeah.
I think that's so fascinating, the iceberg thing. I read a brief from the Marvel Studios recently, and they said when they introduce characters, they need to introduce who they are, what their values are, and what their powers are. And their values often hint at something you don't hear until later. Like we just had Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, and he's kind of a control freak, and his former girlfriend's like, you're the one who always has to hold the knife, and you don't find out until later it's because as a child his sister died and he feels responsible and he always wants. And it's great to have those little hints that you can pay off later. It's very satisfying when you enjoy a story that gives you that.
Yes, I agree completely with that. I think it's and the other thing about that is I love the Marvel universe, and I love the Game of Thrones universe. And as an author, as a creator of story, if you think about what characters stay with you, so what kind of characters stay with you and what backstories did they have, and then start to think about, why do I like that story? Like, I love Doctor Strange. When the first movie came out, I was like, I could not watch it enough. I was so fascinated with this character. And the reason I was fascinated with the character was he was at the top of his field. And then he was in that car accident where he could no longer operate because his fingers were all mangled and scarred. And he was, he went in search of a situation to get his manual dexterity back. But I thought, wow, I write small town romance. What an interesting character he would be if he was that character, but he now had to practice medicine in a small town, right? So then you get the grumpy doctor who's got an ego in a small town, totally fish out of water and making him suffer. That's another thing that I'm really an evangelist about, is like your plot should make the character suffer. You choose the worst hero to get the job done, right?
Oh, that's it. I'd never heard somebody say that, but I like that. The worst hero to get the job done.
Yeah, that's a good one. So what do you create first? Do you create your characters first and then figure out sort of where to drop them? Or do you figure out your plot and then say, what kind of character do I need to make this plot work?
You know, I'm at a point now where it used to be when I was a young writer that I would find characters like Doctor Strange and they would hit me that way. But I'm hybrid. So I write for traditional publishers and as indie, and traditional publishers will always ask me for a lot of tropey situations, right? And so I will think of unique tropey situations and then say, okay, what's the worst hero or heroine to get this done?
I love that though, because that, you know, we used to have characters like the Saint who were like too good to be true, and now these days we like our flawed heroines and flawed heroes and heroines, and they need to have that to make them resonate. But the idea of picking the worst one to get the job done is brilliant advice.
Yeah, and you know, I think what really works with that is that in novels you need conflict, and you're almost like guaranteeing yourself conflict and not even having to manufacture it by using that advice. You're taking the worst hero to get the job done. Well, that's going to cause conflict because he's going to have all sorts of problems with getting that job done, but he'll still do it, right?
Yeah, I mean, the first part, if someone says to you, what's your story about, right? The usual answer is an encapsulation of the plot, right? The external conflict of the plot. Like an astronaut is stranded on Mars, right? The Martian.
Mm-hmm. The Martian, yeah.
Right. And then when they say, tell me more, that's when you start talking about character. But it just kind of depends as a working author, how you approach it. Right.
And the Martian is such a great example, though, because he's such a strong character where he's like, I'm going to science the shit out of this, even though it is he's battling an external like conflict. His character is so important to driving the story forward.
Yeah, because he's a scientist, right? And he's kind of a normal person who just believes in science. So he doesn't really have an emotional wound, right? He would fall into the raised category. He was raised to be this logical thinker. But the conflict that he has is nothing grows on Mars. Like, how am I gonna survive if nothing grows on Mars? I have to, like you said, science the shit out of it, which goes against everything that everyone has already tried to solve, right? But he has motivation because he will die.
And motivation is very important once characters. I read somewhere that your book will succeed if you can establish what the characters need, not what they want.
I think that's the external plot is usually what they want, right? And then they find out along the way that maybe it's not exactly what they need, or maybe they need something different than they thought at first.
Right. Usually they end up, by the end of the story, they get what they need more than what they want.
If they have grown and changed, right?
Yeah.
I think the Rolling Stones wrote a song about this.
Get what you need. Yeah.
You can't always get what you want.
Exactly. I sing that to my kids all the time. So in your book, and actually earlier you mentioned sort of these 18 character, what are they? They're traits or types?
No, they were originally called schemas, right? It's a scheme of, I've been hurt, how do I protect myself? The brain is very good about figuring out how to protect themselves. Now, psychologists are calling it life traps. So it's a life trap that we fall into. We can't be happy in a marriage. We can't be happy in a job. We can't, we are too reactive and angry and things like that. So we fall into this life trap, and it's figuring out what the trigger is. So there are some that are very common, abandoned, right? You were abandoned in some way. Either you grew up with a parent who wasn't there the way you needed them to be, didn't protect you the way they needed to be, or you could literally be left left in a lurch by a lover or something. Or there's betrayal, which goes beyond, like an emotional relationship betrayal. Like it could be you're a thief and your gang betrayed you. There is alienation. I don't know if you guys remember the 100-Foot Journey, where a family from India moves across the street from a restaurant, a French restaurant, a 5-star Michelin restaurant, and they, he's the hero is an Indian cook, but he wants to learn the French way, but he's different. Alienation is just, you feel different for whatever reason. You could be in high school and feel different. That's the beauty about these things, is there are examples that go up and down the spectrum of any type of story. There's being a martyr, like George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life, right? He was a martyr, and he actually learned that it was good. He was bitter about being a martyr, right? And the whole movie is his backstory of what had happened in the past and the choices he had made to put others' needs ahead of his, right? And then he learned what would have happened if he hadn't been there. That's so interesting.
That is really interesting, because in some ways he's making the rod for his own back with his thing. He did these things and then he gets resentful about it. And I think that's one of the reasons that movie resonates with people, because so many of us, we do so much for the people we love, and then we get resentful when we're not appreciated for it. And so it resonates. Yeah.
And even part of that you could say is Captain America, because he was the true martyr, right? He was always going to put other people's needs first, even though he was bullied, because as a child in his teenage years, he was just small and wimpy. He was bullied. We can all relate to that. But then in the end, he chose himself.
And that's very interesting, because while at the same time he is this superhero and he's super principled and things, to a certain extent he has a bit of a chip on his shoulder, which makes him an interesting character.
Mm-hmm.
He's not perfect, although he's kind of perfect, except he's not perfect.
Yes, well, no one can be perfect, otherwise they probably would not resonate with us.
Well, yeah, that was always, I think, what people used to argue about why DC wasn't as good as Marvel, because the DC characters were all perfect. You had Superman and you had Wonder Woman, and you'd have, not so much Batman, I guess, but, Superman was this, guy who was flawless, basically. And then it becomes harder and harder to write storylines because he's perfect and he's the strongest and the best at everything, and then you have to come up with some sort of ridiculous.
And then you watch a show like the Boys, where you have what Superman might really be like. Yeah,
exactly. I love The Boys. I mean, and that's great characters in that one.
Yeah, there are great characters in that one. Say what you will about Tom Cruise, but I think he really understands character, because if you look at his Mission Impossible character, the addition of him falling in love but having to give up his wife to protect her is awesome. He's constantly, he reveals a vulnerability about his characters.
And there's a reason that series of movies, which is basically he funds them himself, have done so phenomenally well. I think it's because of that. He has a deep understanding.
Right.
Yeah, I agree totally. I can enjoy I know that The Gray Man has been dinged for being too commercial, but we're all in this not only because we love to tell story, but because we want to get paid.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And in the end, I think, those Mission Impossible movies, I enjoyed The Gray Man. I don't know.
I haven't watched it yet, but I will, because it's got so many alumni. But I think to be honest, what you nailed it there is, like, if you want to be a commercially successful author, having strong characters is like one of the bits I think that's really going to help you with that, because we've been chatting to other people over the last few weeks about the importance of your cover and the importance of your blurb, and getting people to read your book is one part of the hurdle. But if you want them to read your second book or your third book, or subscribe to your newsletter and buy every single book you write, if you can have really richly realized characters, then people get invested in them. And, you know, I'm 12 books into my book series and people email me about these characters and it's like, wow, it means something. And it's so validating, but also it's the reason I think that authors can become successful.
Yeah, and not only that, is if you want them to tell other people about your book, they have to, you know, like the characters and be invested in it, right? So it's not just them buying all your other books, but them telling all their friends and family, buy these books, they're awesome, right? Word of mouth. So if you're gonna create these characters, you know, so where do you start? You know, I know a lot of people will be like taking characters from people they know in real life as an inspiration, right? But obviously there's only so many interesting people we can have in our lives. So you're going to have to come up with something else. You're going to have to draw from another source at some point. So, you know, I guess you start with those 18 life traps, figure out, I guess, sort of some of them. How do you start?
Yeah, I mean, if you, let's say you're having trouble, your books aren't selling, or if you're trying to be traditionally published, you keep getting rejected. And if some of the feedback is, I can't connect with these characters, you know, I would look at how you're constructing your characters and what you need to do. So you could pick up this book. I'm showing the very attractive orangey color of the cover, but if you know, you could look through things. What I advise people to do is to look through the list and the examples of movie characters and see which ones are kind of drawing you in, or which characters you absolutely loved, you know, and you can't let go of. Because like the Doctor Strange example that I made, you could really relate to these people. I find that I like to write a good redemption story. I like to write heroes who have done something wrong, you know, when they were younger. You know how, I mean, we can all kind of relate to that, you know, a bitchy moment when we were younger, lashing out when we shouldn't have, or whatever. And then realizing later that, wow, I should make amends for that somehow. I really like writing characters like that, characters that are in impossible situations. Like I just wrote a story about a hero who had a multi-generational ranch and he really wanted the line to continue, but his wife had died. He had just one young daughter and he didn't want that all to fall on her, but he was going through skin cancer treatment and they told him that he might become sterile. And he stopped the treatment because he wanted to like find a wife, find a woman, ensure how important this generational ranch was to him, like do all these things, right? And then he meets a woman from the city who is not ready to fall in love, right? Like what emotional conflict are you going to get into? But this book is kind of like a resource to say, hey, this kind of character resonates with me. And what I have found personally is that the same kind of characters resonate with me that have maybe some of the emotional wounds that I went through when I was a kid.
So if you were to look at, you know, characters in general, you know, through movies and through books and through, you know, what you've learned through your writing of this book and psychology, what is it really that makes a character unforgettable? Is it their backstory? Is it the way that they interact with the other characters in their lives and the choices they make? You know, what is that part that authors really need to focus on to make sure that their character is unforgettable?
I think you just really have to have a heart for that character and bring them to life, because it's different every time, right? Sometimes it's the emotional backstory that they went through that resonates. Sometimes it's the person that they are today and the hard choices that they're making for the good of other people, even though they're getting pressure. Like you guys probably haven't watched Bridgerton season 2, but Anthony had to, you know, he had to produce an heir, find a wife, you know, find a perfect wife. And everyone kept telling him, no, fall in love, fall in love, fall in love. He's like, no, I have this responsibility, and don't be, I need to find the best woman, not the person that I love. And there was a purpose behind all that, and the conflict that he goes through. I think maybe as I'm rambling on here that I'm coming to the conclusion that it is the inner conflict that they go through and where they net out at the end. Because if they're a flat person that doesn't really grow, they're really not very interesting.
Right. That's, yeah. The growth, I think, is what keeps people invested in a character over multiple books and stories and arcs and things.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's the key. Is it's almost like there's a lot that can make them unforgettable, but I think the problem is that more people don't delve deep enough and they end up with the forgettable. It's easier to make them forgettable than it is to make them unforgettable. But I think that it's that detail that you go into. It's the idea of not making them flat, not making them just the standard character doing the standard things for the standard reasons, because everybody's got their own backstory, and it's the creation and the sort of and the pulling out of that backstory and the making choices that make sense for that backstory, and maybe they're hard choices and stuff like that, right? So that's what is going to probably make these characters forgettable, as opposed to the guy just goes through the motions of things and you never really tell us why.
Yeah, I think if it goes back to show don't tell, right? So if you tell people, oh, I just don't, me as a character, I just don't trust women because I've had too many women burn me before. When I was in the corporate world, I worked with a cultural psychologist who was helping us create brands that would be so irresistible on the shelf, right, that people would have to grab them. And so we were doing these sessions with consumers where they would write in the category we were working in, what was the first time you were aware of this category? What was the most important time that you were aware of this category? And what was the most recent time? And I like to do that with my characters when I'm creating backstory. So like, what was the first time something happened to them? And it can be done in shards of glass of a backstory throughout the story that you're relaying this, or it can be, a brief hit of that time. And then what was the most important or impactful in the gray man that comes to him when he's, fighting, what's his name? Captain America's character, the villain. And
with that little mustache.
Yeah. And as he is being, practically killed, he flashes back to his father doing the same move, right? And how he got out of that. So there's some of that there. That would be, maybe you would argue, the one of the most important and telling things about his character and how he is able to come back. Because I had just been about to turn to my husband and say, wow, he just always just endures, and then they motivated the reason that he endures is so hard to kill, right? So if you think about the first time this happened, the most important time, and maybe the most recent time, to kind of flesh out, make them real, rather than just telling, somebody cheated on me. You show them as if you were actually writing that backstory in present time. And a lot of times I journal in first person as my characters when I think about these emotional backstories and how they were. And the first page or so is just Drek. But then all of a sudden you'll write something and you'll be like, that's it. That's it right there.
And one of the other things I got from your book that I thought was really interesting was how, characters to a certain extent will drive your plot. I think a lot of people sort of approach the story as, we need the plot for the story and you put the characters into it. Whereas I got from your book the potential to have characters who generate a plot by the conflict that naturally exists when you place one character, another character, and they each have different motivations and those conflict.
Well, I think in the script writing world, the external plot is the story engine, right? It's the logistics of the things that have to happen, right? So if you have an evil villain, how you escalate the evil villain doing things and how they are going about trying to stop the evil villain. And then the subtext, the really fine flavors when you go out to have a fine meal. Those fine flavors come in when you flesh out the characters and you make them more real.
Right. Yeah, I think that's the important thing, the show don't tell. I mean, it's something we say about writing in general, but I think with characters, it's really important because that's how you get people invested in it, right? It's the empathy that we have for that character, whether they're evil or not. At some point, you're revealing something that somebody's gonna feel, right? And that'll make them connect to that character, and say, okay, well, I don't agree with his choices now, but I feel bad for what led him to make those choices.
Yeah, exactly. That can be, if you're writing an anti-hero, that can be totally key. I mean, I don't know, you guys have probably heard of the Save the Cat series of books and everything.
That's a terrific one.
Yeah, and I recently was reading something for another author, and she had a very selfish character, and I'm like, it's 3 pages until she says or does anything that totally makes me want to stay with her for a full story. Like, have her save the cat up front, even if they're a villain. It makes them interesting that there are these contradictions.
I think going back to Marvel, I mean, Thanos as a character was such an interesting character because he was basically committing genocide. At the same time, he was presented in such a way that a lot of people, they didn't necessarily sympathize with him, but they understood and they had a certain respect for him, and he had a nobility and a morality, even though what he was doing was intrinsically evil.
Right. And I mean, sometimes you can agree with somebody's feelings about something, but not take it to the extreme that they necessarily take it to. I remember during this will probably sound terrible, but during COVID, we were out at some point, like near the end of it, and we were at a theme park here and a water park, and COVID, it's still not over, and it definitely wasn't over at that point, and it was just packed, and I was thinking to myself, now I understand what Thanos was saying. It is too overcrowded. There are too many people, but I'm not willing to snap my fingers and get rid of half of them. But yeah, like, you can sort of see why they are who they are, and that's super important, even when you don't want to do what they do.
Yeah, and it is a dance of pacing, what to tell when, and you just have to write and write and write some more to find your storytelling voice, which, like Julia Quinn does those prologues. I don't do those prologues, but I really admire her for doing them. I think they're great. But everybody's storytelling voice is different, and you just need to find a way that works for you so that every time a reader picks up a book, going forward, they're going to know that you're going to provide them with this kind of experience.
I have found this such a fascinating conversation. Unfortunately, we are approaching the top of the hour, so we have to cut things short. But I mean, I think character is such an overlooked thing that it's been so interesting to see you focus so much on like explaining the importance of it. So thank you so much for sharing it. Craig, do you have any more questions before we unfortunately have to wrap things up?
No more questions. I agree. Like, this is a really important topic, and I'm really glad that you took the time to come in and get into it with us, because this is something that a lot of authors, even when they don't realize it, they struggle with it. I mean, some get it right, but a lot don't, and sometimes they aren't sure what it is about their book that isn't working. And I think if you can get your characters right, your plot is almost less important than your characters. If you have strong characters that people really connect with, or at least, they're unforgettable, then you can probably make a story work when the plot isn't as good as the reverse. I think it would be harder to make a book work where you had a strong plot but weak characters than if you had strong characters and a weak plot. So
yeah, I agree. Great.
So, Melinda, where can people find out more about not just your book or characterization, but also your books? You're a USA Today best-selling author. So where can people find you?
Yeah, I'm at melindacurtis.com, and there's a welcome page which will direct you, like, hey, do you like to read about small town books? Do you like romantic comedy? Do you like to learn more about writing craft? So you can just go from there.
That is brilliant. And we shall make sure to put a link down below in the description of this video, whether you're listening on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts, or watching on YouTube. But don't leave it there. Leave Melinda a comment down below. Let us know what you think of her as our guest. We really appreciated all of the insight that she's brought to it. And if you haven't already, make sure you hit that like button and hit that subscribe button. So Melinda, thank you so much for joining us. I think it's been a wonderful episode, and I really hope people enjoy your book as much as I did and get as much value from it as I did. And we will be back next week with another episode of Fully Booked. Until then, thank you very much. Goodbye.